Hi everybody, I'm Ryan. In the hotel room at Grand Prix. Jeez, I did that again. I'm in the hotel room at RC Charlotte. Just getting some work done, making some videos, hanging out. I'm recording in the bathroom because it has the best lighting. We'll see about the audio because I'm using my mobile setup. But today we're going to talk about interesting interactions in Standard. Things that you need to know about if you plan on playing Standard ever, and things you might not think of until they actually come up or you lose to them. So the first off is Shieldred mirrors. Yes, Shieldred's still played in Standard in a little bit of a capacity, but it's important to understand that when you both have a Shieldred and you draw a card, two triggers enter the stack. They are technically separate triggers. Now, most of the time, you just shortcut, they counteract each other, everything's good. But if one player has 2 or less life, it's important to understand that one trigger resolves and then the other resolves. So how do they enter the stack? The answer is the active player's trigger is the one who enters the stack first, which means it's the person whose turn it is. So if it's my turn, we both have Shieldreds, I draw a card, my Shieldred trigger enters the stack first, your Shieldred trigger enters the stack second. So gain life is underneath lose life. So if I'm at 2 or less life, I lose the game because, the stack works last in, first out. So that's really important to remember. Next up is weird stuff with Tishana's Tidebinder. So I'm gonna read Tishana's Tidebinder. Tishana's Tidebinder is a 3-mana 3/2 with flash. When it enters the battlefield, counter to one target activated or triggered ability. If an ability of an artifact, creature, or planeswalker is countered this way, that permanent loses all abilities for as long as Tishana's Tidebinder remains on the battlefield. The reason it's a weird card is that, one, it doesn't turn off every single type of permanent. It's just creatures, planeswalkers, or artifacts, which means if it counters the activation of a manland, then yeah, it counters the activation that your opponent wasted the mana, but they can activate it again. If it counters the activation of a enchantment, so something like Wedding Announcement, yeah, it counters it, but it can trigger again. There's some exceptions to this, like if it counters a Leyline Binding or something, then the trigger's gone and Leyline Binding is just on the battlefield doing nothing, which technically still has the text, but it didn't exile anything. And then battles, for example, it can counter battles in a few different ways. It can counter the enter the battlefield ability for battles, but also it's a trigger when battles are defeated. So your opponent could defeat one of your battles, and then you could counter the trigger that makes it flip, which is actually really silly. Next up is Preacher the Schism. Preacher the Schism is really interesting because, I'll read it first. It's a 3-mana 2/4 with Death Touch. When it attacks the player with the most life or tied for the most life, create a 1/1 white vampire creature token with lifelink. Whenever Preacher the Schism attacks while you have the most life or tied for the most life, you draw a card and lose a life. So when it attacks, it always gets at least one of those triggers. Notice I said at least because if you have the same life, then it gets both triggers, which is so powerful. Drawing a card and creating a threat is insane. So sort of a mini game is formed where if you have cards that have you lose life, the thing that pops in my head immediately are like pain lands, like Llanowar Waste. You kind of want to be dealing damage to yourself so you keep life totals the same, or using those vampires to gain life, or like maybe only attacking with one of the vampires so that you only gain a certain amount of life and your opponent only loses a certain amount of life. So Preacher the Schism can still trigger for both abilities. It's really interesting how you can exert value from Preacher the Schism. And if you're playing against it, making sure your opponent does not. Next up, if you have a Glissa and your opponent has an Archfiend of the Dross, they have to block it. The reason that they have to block it is that Glissa's last ability, which is kind of its secret ability because no one ever uses it, is remove up to 3 counters from target permanent. Now, if you're removing 3 counters from target permanent, that includes the oil counters on Archfiend of the Dross, which means if you pass the game, trigger Archfiend of the Dross, they lose the game. And Glissa has First Strike Death Touch, so if your opponent is heads up, they have to block the Glissa. So you just get to eat an Archfiend of the Dross, which is insanely good. Or if they're not playing heads up and they let Glissa through, and they're expecting you to draw a card or something like that, you just remove counters from Archfiend, pass the turn, you win the game. Keep that in mind. Those are the interesting interactions that I could think of. If you can think of any more interesting interactions in Standard, let me know in the comments. And if you like this video, please be sure to like and subscribe. Check me out on social medias. Links are above me and in the description. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.